What's up guys, now in today's video we're going to be revisiting one of the very first graphics cards that we actually featured on the channel. This is the graphics card in question, and it was actually sent to us by one of our most prestige followers back during the GPU apocalypse, and it's because they actually had an upgrade and they wanted to provide the channel with something to produce some kind of content on. I wanted to actually revisit it today just to see how well it performs in 2024. So if you haven't guessed already, this is the AMD Radeon RX 470. This is actually a 4GB model, and it's a pretty cool one at that. These were actually from a generation that was extremely popular with AMD, probably one of their most successful generations, purely because of the price to performance that everybody got all the way back in 2016. AMD dropped the RX series, including the RX 480, which is phenomenally well known, the RX 470, just like this one, and the RX 460. Now the RX 460 wasn't the best graphics card at all. We have had them on the channel, and its performance just doesn't match these at all, but the 470 and the 480 actually performed exceptionally well. The specific model that we've got here is the XFX RS Black, and it is a pretty cool graphics card, particularly for the price that these would have cost. These would have cost you around $230 back then, which was astounding for the actual performance you were getting. And this model comes with a full aluminium backplate, which is pretty unique compared to some of the graphics cards that we've had from that era, and it has a full black shroud on the front with a dual fan configuration. What actually makes these even cooler is the fact that you can remove the front fans. All you got to do is just push in the little clips and pull the fans out like that, which makes it really good. There's not many graphics cards, or not many at all to be honest, in modern days that will actually give you this kind of feature. It is so that you can actually give the fans a good clean, and you can also swap them out for some LED models. Now I've never actually swapped the fans out on this one. Of course they are still the stock fans that originally came with it, but you used to be able to get them in red, blue or green, and you can kind of match your build up with it. Nowadays you don't really need to do that because a lot of graphics cards, particularly high-end ones, do come with RGB lighting on them, and you can change that to whatever you want. But for its day, that was actually a pretty cool feature. Requiring only a single 6-pin connection, these would actually fit many different builds, particularly things like pre-builds that had one kind of PCIe connection, and they didn't really use that much power either, but the performance you got was pretty good. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily true nowadays, because when it actually comes to testing these kind of things, you will struggle on some of the super modern games. One of the ones that just will not play on this is of course Alan Wake 2. Not only is the graphics card not really supported, but AMD are slowing the drivers down on these nowadays, and you're not really going to get the kind of support for modern games like that and beyond. In actual fact, when we tried to come and test this card in Alan Wake 2, we kind of hit issues straight away. As soon as you start the game, you will get GPU driver errors. It will let you continue, the game will start, but then once you get into game, it will crash and it will give you the same error again. So unfortunately we couldn't add that to the testing, but we managed to test a lot more. All of the testing that we did on this card, we restricted to a 1080p resolution, and to be honest, that's as far as you could take this graphics card. In Cyberpunk 2077, to be able to get this card to play at any kind of decent performance, we had to set the preset to a medium setting while enabling FSR 2.1 with a balanced. With this configuration, you will get an average of 53 frames per second with a 1% low of 42. Now that meant that the game actually did nearly provide a 60 FPS experience, but with these settings it ran perfectly smooth, and graphically it looked great too. There wasn't any kind of warnings on this in terms of VRAM or anything like that. The game was just more than playable. Moving on to Dead Island 2, again running the game in 1080p with a medium preset, but this time enabling FSR 2 with a balanced setting. We managed to get an average of 72 frames per second with a 1% low of 33. It's not the high FPS experience that we were used to with this game, but it runs really well and it provides a smooth experience. Those low 1% lows would actually shock you a little bit, but to be honest, you didn't really see them at all. There wasn't any major stuttering in the game and it played perfectly smooth. And again, just like Cyberpunk 2077, we had no kind of VRAM warnings or issues at all. Hogwarts Legacy was a bit of a surprise to us here, running the game in 1080p with a medium preset, and again enabling FSR 2 with a quality setting this time. We managed to get an average of 68 frames per second with a 1% low of 51. I would probably consider that as a 60 FPS experience here, and the game went absolutely beautiful. It was extremely smooth to be able to move around and actually do lots of things, even in the built up towns, and it looked absolutely great with the settings, so Hogwarts Legacy is definitely a game you can still play on an RX 470. Even more surprising, in Horizon Forbidden West, running the game at 1080p with a low preset this time and enabling FSR 2.2 with a balance setting, we managed to get an average of 45 frames per second with a 1% low of 33. At these settings, the game doesn't look great, to be honest, compared to what we're used to, and it's not the smoothest of experience, but it is actually playable with a rough 30 FPS console-like experience. This is one of the games where the RX 470 really does start to show its age, particularly with that 4GB of VRAM, but it did actually play the game, so I'm going to consider that as a win. One of the hardest games to actually run in our test suite is of course RoboCop Rogue City, and it really did struggle on this card. I don't think you're going to get a decent experience out of this, even though the performance looked reasonably well according to the metrics. Running the game in 1080p with a low preset where the game didn't look very good, and enabling FSR 3 with a performance setting and turning on frame generation, we managed to get an average of 50 frames per second with a 1% low of 21. The game just does not look good with these settings, and the performance is no better. Unfortunately, even AMD's FSR 3 plus frame gen here couldn't quite save the RX 470, so if you want to play this game, it is actually time to upgrade, particularly with those low 1% lows. Starfield, on the other hand, was actually a game that played reasonably well on this card. When the game was actually released, it didn't perform well on anything, but since it's had lots of new upgrades and features, you can actually get it working on pretty old cards now, and you can have a decent experience. Running this game in 1080p with a medium preset this time, and enabling FSR 3 with 100% render resolution, so it's not really upscaling anything. While enabling frame generation, we managed to get an average of 53 frames per second with a 1% low of 40. This is one game where FSR 3 and frame generation really does help an old card like this. Even though it's not officially supported, the game actually looks quite good with these kind of settings, and the performance provides a pretty okay experience. The game is more than playable, so if you are running an RX 470, you'd be glad to know that you can run Starfield and have a good time. The last game in our testing was of course The Last of Us Part 1. Again, this is another game that when released run very poorly on most hardware, particularly things like this, but just like with Starfield, with the many updates and upgrades that it's had, it's actually starting to get much better, particularly when we've got access to things like FSR 3 now. Running the game in 1080p with a low preset and enabling FSR 3 with a quality setting plus frame generation, we managed to get an average of 79 frames per second with a 1% low of 56. Now, due to the low VRAM on this card, the game does struggle a little bit here and there, and you will get a few warnings in the settings when you try to enable things, but of course frame generation here actually really saved the day because it performed exceptionally well. Even with the low settings of the game, it still looked absolutely great, and frame generation just worked flawlessly here, no issues at all. Again, even though it's not officially supported, which is actually a fantastic thing because that means that RX 470 owners will be able to play one of the best games of our generation. Overall, the RX 470 seemed to have enough power to play most of the modern games that we tested, although you will need to actually start turning those settings down now and utilize like AMD's FSR technologies, but it just goes to show that the card even now today is still a great bang for the buck, and it's a shame that they will be going out of support. So as you can see from those benchmarks, the little RX 470 actually still put up a fight in most of those games. It's unfortunate that anything newer than Alan Wake 2 really is just not going to cut it anymore, and you will need to upgrade, and particularly games like RoboCop Rogue City, which would actually start and play. It looked absolutely terrible, so you're just going to have to upgrade if you want to play that. But for everything else, you could actually get a pretty decent playable experience. For a lot of that, we do have to thank AMD's FSR technologies, particularly FSR 3 with frame generation. Even though it's not officially supported on these cards according to AMD, it will actually work, and it works pretty well. It is a bit of a shame that this card is only a 4GB card because they did do multiple versions back when it was released. Just like the RX 480, you got 8GB versions as well as 4GB versions. I may actually have a look to see if I can get an 8GB version of one of these, see if we can do a bit of a comparison and see if the additional VRAM will actually improve any of those scores, but you guys are going to have to wait till next time for that one. Let me know in the comments below if you have an RX 470 or if you actually had one previously. What kind of performance did you get? What kind of games are you playing? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. I'm sure we're going to be looking at many more graphics cards going forward, and I'm sure as always, catch you guys in the next one.